There is a dangerous beauty in raw ambition and the lengths people will go to achieve their ultimate dreams. Witness the rise and the risks in our latest series of high-stakes cinematic dramas. Hit subscribe now and see what happens when the stakes are high.
My ex-wife remarried 6 weeks after our divorce was finalized. Big celebration. Rooftop venue in Houston. 180 guests. Everything she'd been planning in her head while we were still married. I found out through a LinkedIn notification. I was sitting in a cafe in Valletta, Malta, watching fishing boats come into the harbor, drinking the best coffee I'd had in 30 years. I felt nothing except grateful. Then, 3 months later, my son called me from the parking lot of a federal courthouse, voice shaking, asking if I had known. I told him I had tried to tell him. He said he knew. He said he was sorry. That conversation took 4 years in a federal indictment to happen, and by the time it did, his mother had lost everything she had traded me for. My name is Daniel Harrington. I'm 63 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that the quietest exit is sometimes the loudest statement you'll ever make. Before we get into it, quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know who's out there. And fair warning, this story contains fictionalized elements built around real patterns and real lessons. Any resemblance to specific people is coincidental. But the truth underneath it? That part is 100% real. Now let's get into it. I spent 31 years as a licensed architect in Houston, Texas. Built a firm from a 2-person office above a dry cleaner on Westheimer into a 12-person practice with a portfolio that included 2 hospitals, a university library, and 400 units of housing that I was genuinely proud of. I sold the firm in 2021 for enough money that I never had to work again. I was 61 years old and I thought that selling the thing I had built might finally make my wife, Sandra, proud of me. I was wrong about that, the way I had been wrong about Sandra for most of our marriage. She was a residential real estate agent, good at it. She had the gift of making people feel like they were getting exactly what they deserved, which is more skill than it sounds. She dressed well, spoke confidently, and had an instinct for which rooms to show first and which problems to bury. I admired those things about her for the first 10 years. In year 11, I started recognizing them as the same skills she used on me. Our house was in Memorial, 4 bedrooms, in-ground pool, the kind of property that photographs better than it lives. Sandra had staged it so relentlessly that I could never fully relax in it. The wrong throw pillow on the couch meant a 20-minute conversation about aesthetic coherence. I stopped having friends over because their shoes tracked in evidence of real life. By year 24, I was eating breakfast alone in the kitchen before she woke up, because those 45 minutes before the performance began were the only part of the day that felt like mine. We had 2 kids, Meg, 31, structural engineer in Denver, sharp, direct, emotionally honest in a way that used to embarrass her mother at dinner tables, and Carter, 28, who worked in tech marketing in Austin and who had decided sometime around age 17 that I was the source of tension in our family and Sandra was the one holding everything together. He was not wrong that there was tension. He was wrong about its source. But Sandra had been curating his version of events for years, and I didn't fight it the way I should have. The stroke scare came in March of 2022. Minor, they said. A TIA, transient ischemic attack. I was at the firm 3 days before closing, reviewing the final transfer documents, when the right side of my face went numb and the pen in my hand felt like it belonged to someone else. My assistant drove me to the ER. Sandra was showing a property in Bel Air and sent a text that said, "Let me know what they say." She arrived 4 hours later, after the scans were done, and the neurologist had already spoken to me twice. The neurologist was a small, careful woman who chose her words the way a carpenter chooses lumber. She sat across from me and said, "Mr. Harrington, your brain just sent you a very clear message. The question is whether you're going to listen to it." I told her I was listening. Sandra was in the waiting area answering emails. Lying in that hospital bed, I did the accounting that sick people do when they're forced to be still. I had spent 31 years building something real, something that stood up, something with my name on it. I could not say the same about my marriage. I was a prop in Sandra's life, useful for income, for the address, for the stories she told at open houses about her husband, the architect, but a prop that had been growing inconvenient, too quiet at her events. not interested enough in the right people. Embarrassing in small ways, she cataloged carefully and deployed strategically. Meg drove up from Denver and sat with me through the second night. She brought a book she didn't read and a bag of things I actually liked to eat, which told me she had paid more attention to me in her adult life than her mother had in 30 years. Carter called from Austin. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He said good. He said Sandra seemed really shaken up. I didn't point out that Sandra had been in the waiting room for 4 hours before she came to find me. The discharge nurse walked me out. She had one of those faces that hold things without saying them. At the car, she paused and said, "Take care of yourself, Mr. Harrington. You're the only one who's going to." I thanked her. I drove home alone because Sandra had an appraisal meeting she couldn't move. That night, I sat in my drafting room, the only space in the house that was actually mine, and I did what I had done with every design problem I had ever faced. I looked at the structure. I found the load-bearing elements. I identified what was failing. The marriage was failing everywhere that mattered. Sandra hadn't seen me as a person in a decade. My son had been handed a version of me that wasn't true, and he had no reason to question it. My daughter was the only one in the family operating from accurate information. My body had just told me in the clearest possible terms that the current arrangement was going to kill me. I started planning the way I had always planned. Quietly. Methodically. Without announcing anything. The firm sale had netted me $3.8 million after taxes and legal fees. I restructured everything over the following 3 months. I set up a trust with Meg as trustee, funded at $1.9 million, completely insulated. Another $800,000 went into accounts Sandra had no access to or knowledge of, all documented, all legal. My passive income from the portfolio and a small number of commercial leases would run about $52,000 annually. My research indicated that living in Malta, specifically Valletta, would cost me approximately $2,800 a month, including rent, food, health insurance, and a life that was actually worth living. The house in Memorial was worth $1.1 million, mortgage-free. I refinanced and pulled out $700,000. Sandra signed where I told her to sign. She had always treated her finances as my department, which suited her perfectly when the money was flowing and suited me perfectly now. The house ended up with a $700,000 mortgage attached to it. I left it for her, along with everything inside it, the furniture she had chosen, the art she had hung, the life she had arranged. I filed for divorce through my attorney in November. Sandra would be served after I left. I told Meg over dinner at a place she liked in the Highlands neighborhood of Denver. I laid out the complete picture, the trust, the timeline, the plan, the date. She put her fork down and looked at me for a long time. She said, "Dad, I've been waiting for this conversation for 6 years." I said I knew. She said Carter was going to be blindsided. I said I knew that too. She said she would be there for him. I told her that was all I needed to hear. I did not tell Carter. He was 28 years old and still operating inside his mother's narrative. I couldn't give him information Sandra would immediately use. That was a painful calculation, but it was the correct one. February 9th, 2023 arrived on a Thursday. I was up at 4:30. 2 suitcases at the door. 31 years of a life, and it fit in luggage I could carry myself. I left the divorce papers on the kitchen island under the coffee maker, which was the one place Sandra looked every single morning. On top, a handwritten note. "The house is yours. The mortgage information is in the folder. I wish you well." I closed the door at 5:15. The Uber was already waiting. At the airport, I called Meg. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "I'm at the terminal." She said, "Text me when you're over the water." I told her to take care of herself. She said she always did. Then she said, "Dad, go be happy. You've earned it." I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that. I just held the phone for a moment. The flight went through Newark, then Lisbon, then a short connection to Malta. Somewhere over the Atlantic, eating a meal I didn't choose off a tray I didn't ask for, I noticed that my right hand was completely steady. I hadn't noticed how much it shook in the house until it stopped. By the time Sandra found the papers, I was over Portugal. I arrived in Valletta on a Friday morning. The The city is built from limestone that has been sitting in the same place since the 16th century. Everything is golden and warm and slightly improbable, like a place someone designed for the purpose of making you feel like time works differently here. I found my apartment on the second floor of a converted palazzo in Merchant Street. High ceilings, old tile, a window that looked out onto a street where people walked slowly and spoke loudly and didn't seem to be performing anything for anyone. The landlord was a 70-year-old man named Joseph who spoke 4 languages and was interested in none of my history. He showed me where the water shutoff was, handed me 2 keys, and said, "Welcome to Malta. Don't rush anywhere." Those were the best instructions I'd ever received. I built a routine without designing one. I walked the bastions in the morning before it got hot. I found a coffee bar run by a man named Marcus who was 45 and lived in 3 countries and had a policy of not asking customers questions unless they asked him first. I started sketching again, not professionally, just for the pleasure of looking carefully at things. The fortifications around Valletta are some of the most architecturally sophisticated defensive structures ever built. I spent 3 months just drawing sections of the upper baracca. Nobody asked me why. Nobody asked me anything. My blood pressure dropped to a 16/71 within 2 months. I lost 14 pounds without trying. I slept 8 hours a night in a room with a window that let in the smell of the harbor. Meg called every Sunday. She had been promoted, was leading a major infrastructure project in Colorado, seemed genuinely settled. Carter had not called. Meg said he was processing. I said I understood. I gave him room because that was what I could give him, and because some distances can only be crossed when the person on the other side decides to start walking. The message from my college friend arrived in July. Tom Baxter, who I had lost touch with 15 years ago, found me on LinkedIn and sent a note. He said he had heard through mutual Houston connections that Sandra had gotten remarried. Fast. To someone named Victor Crane, who ran an investment platform called Apex Altitude Capital. He said the wedding was in September. He said he thought I should know. He said I seemed like I was doing well based on my profile photo, which showed me standing on the bastions of Valletta looking like a man who had somewhere to be. I wrote back, "Thanks, Tom. I'm genuinely well." Then I closed the message and went to make coffee. But I'm an architect. I look at foundations. I don't know how to turn that off. Victor Crane's public presence was substantial. Instagram, LinkedIn, a personal website that used the word visionary 4 times on the homepage. 41 years old, Austin-based, founder of Apex Altitude Capital, which described itself as a next-generation alternative investment platform focused on accelerated growth opportunities in emerging sectors. His photos showed him at charity events in a well-cut suit next to Sandra, who looked genuinely happy in a way I couldn't remember seeing in a decade. I looked at the business filings the way I used to look at contractor bids. You learn to read the gap between what something claims and what it can actually bear. Texas Secretary of State records showed Apex Altitude Capital LLC, formed 18 months ago. A related entity, Crane Digital Assets Partners, formed 6 months before that. Another, Altitude Horizon Fund I, formed 2 months before the fund had started accepting investor capital, according to the timeline on Victor's own website. The sequence was interesting. You typically form the fund entity after you've established the management company, not the other way around. The SEC's EDGAR database was more interesting. No registered investment advisor status. No Form AD on file. No exemptions claimed. Victor's website described him as managing over $4.2 million in client assets. Managing other people's investment assets without registration isn't a gray area. It's a federal violation. I pulled court records. Harris County, Travis County, Bexar County. There was a civil judgment against Victor Crane personally from 2021, $87,000, unpaid, from a former business partner named Dennis Caulfield, who had sued for misappropriation of funds. The judgment had never been satisfied. Victor had restructured into a new entity 3 weeks after it was filed. I set my laptop aside and watched the harbor. A large ferry was making its slow way toward the Grand Harbor, moving with the confidence of something that knew exactly where it was going. I thought about Sandra and her new life with a man who dressed beautifully and spoke the language of money and had the same gift she had, making people feel like they were getting exactly what they deserved. And then I thought about Carter. Meg called that night. She had already been digging. She said she'd run Victor's disclosed financials through the same analytical framework she used on construction project audits. She said the numbers didn't survive contact with reality. He was claiming $4.2 million under management and monthly returns of 3 to 4% on investments, which would represent annualized yields of 36 to 48%. She said those numbers required either an investment strategy that nobody on Wall Street had discovered, or a structure where early investors were being paid from new investor capital rather than actual returns. She said there was a third option, which was that the numbers were simply invented. I asked her about the investor pool. She had found a Facebook group for apex altitude investors, 47 members. Most of them were Sandra's contacts from her real estate network. Several had posted screenshots of their account statements, excited about their returns. 2 had mentioned taking out home equity lines to increase their investment. 3 had mentioned telling family members to join. I said, "How much is Carter involved?" Silence. She said Carter had been posting about Victor on his marketing accounts for 4 months. Case studies, endorsements, a video interview on his professional page titled, "What I Learned About Building Wealth from My Stepfather." It had 6,000 views. Meg said that if this went the way she thought it was going to go, Carter's professional social media presence was going to be evidence that he had publicly promoted an unregistered investment scheme. I walked to the window and looked at the street. It was evening, and the limestone had turned amber in the last light. Carter was 28 years old, and he had grown up trusting the wrong person's version of the world. And now he was standing in front of a camera telling 6,000 people to follow a man who was going to end up in federal court. I could not stop what Victor had already set in motion, but I could make sure someone asked the right questions at the right moment. I called a woman named Patricia Sowell. We had worked together on a public housing project in 2014. She was a retired HUD compliance officer who had spent 20 years reviewing exactly the kind of financial structures Victor was operating. I had helped her organization navigate some difficult permitting issues, and she had told me once that she owed me a favor she intended to keep. I called in that favor. Patricia listened to everything I had. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Daniel, this isn't a gray area. This is textbook Ponzi structure. The question isn't whether it collapses, it's when." I said I knew. I said my son was publicly associated with it. She said she understood. She said she knew exactly the right person. His name was Robert Garrett, 68 years old, retired SEC enforcement attorney. 32 years of federal financial fraud prosecutions. He lived outside Austin. He had a reputation, Patricia said, for being the kind of person who walked into rooms and made other people feel that questions were going to be asked, whether they were ready for them or not. Not aggressive. Precise. The way a structural assessment is precise. Not an attack on the building, just an accurate description of what will fail and when. Sandra and Victor's September wedding was at a venue outside Austin Hill Country, 200 guests, vineyard setting. Carter was the best man. The wedding would have its own photographer, its own videographer, its own social media coverage. Everything Victor did was documented for his platform. Patricia handled the logistics. She knew the event coordinator through professional channels. Robert was added to the guest list as a family friend of the groom's, plausible enough that nobody questioned it. Patricia would attend as his companion. There would be a brief open remarks period after the family toasts. Robert would speak for 3 minutes. That was all he needed. Carter called me 2 weeks before the wedding. The first call in 9 months. His voice was different. Not hostile, but careful, like he was testing a surface before putting his weight on it. He said he was calling because he thought I should hear it from him directly, that he was standing up for Victor at the ceremony. He said Victor had been good for Sandra, had given her stability and direction. He said Victor understood business in a way that he respected. He paused and then said, in a tone that carried something he couldn't quite make himself name, that Victor was the kind of success he wanted for himself one day. I turned off the stove. I said I was glad Sandra had found happiness. He said he appreciated that. He said the wedding was going to be beautiful. I said I hoped it was. Then I said, "Carter, you're good at what you do. You know how to look at a campaign and tell whether the fundamentals support the numbers. Just keep doing that. Don't stop asking those questions because it feels like family now." He was quiet. Then he said he didn't know what I meant by that. I said sometimes the most important things you can do for someone are the simplest ones. Check the foundation before you build on it. He said he had to go, rehearsal dinner prep, and the call ended. I stood on my balcony and watched the lights come on across the harbor. My dinner got cold. The evening was the most beautiful it had been all week, and I stood there with a tight chest that had nothing to do with my heart. Meg texted, "He called you." I texted back, "He did." She said, "That means something." I said, "I know." She said, "I'll take care of him after." I said, "You always do." The wedding was on a Saturday. I was awake before the sun. I walked the bastions while it was still dark. The fortifications lit amber by the old street lamps, and I thought about what I was setting in motion. Was it for Carter? For the 47 investors? For the principle of it? Honest answer. All of those things. And also something quieter. Something that had less to do with Victor and more to do with finally being the kind of father who didn't stay silent to keep the peace. Meg sent updates throughout the day. 4:12 p.m., ceremony starting. Mom looks happy. Victor working every room. Carter standing up front looking proud. 5:47 p.m., reception. Carter's toast just went up on his Instagram Live. He called Victor the most important mentor I've had. I'm standing next to someone who's going to regret having a phone. 6:03 p.m., Robert just arrived. Dad? He looks like a federal judge on vacation. He's wearing a blazer that cost more than my first car. Victor shook his hand and immediately started telling him about the fund's Q3 performance. Robert is nodding like a man being patient. 6:31 p.m. Open remarks starting. Family toasts done. Sandra is crying happy tears. Victor has his arm around her. He has no idea. I was on my balcony when Meg called at 6:45 Austin time, which was 1:45 in the morning my time. She was whispering from just outside the reception area. She said Robert had just taken the microphone. She described it afterward, once she had processed it enough to put it in order. Robert walked to the microphone with the unhurried authority of someone who had been in difficult rooms for 30 years and found none of them particularly alarming. He thanked the wedding planner. He said he had known families in the investment and legal community for many decades, and that he loved the tradition of someone taking a moment to speak plainly. He said he wanted to offer something to the couple that he felt was more valuable than any gift. He said he wanted to talk about foundations. He congratulated Victor on building Apex Altitude Capital in under 2 years. He said that kind of growth was remarkable by any standard. He said that in his experience, growth that rapid came from one of two places: exceptional capitalization or exceptional creativity with other people's money. He said he wasn't sure which category applied here, but that the SEC's public records database, which anyone in the room was welcome to search on their phones right now, did not show any registered investment advisor status for Apex Altitude Capital or its related entities. He said that managing client assets without registration wasn't a question of interpretation. He said there was also a matter of a 2021 civil judgment that remained unsatisfied, which again was public record. He said he wasn't there to cause distress. He was there because he believed the people in that room, particularly the 40-some investors in the fund, several of whom he understood were in attendance, deserved to ask questions now rather than after a federal investigation made asking them irrelevant. He raised his glass. He said, "To Sandra, who deserves every happiness she's pursued. And to Victor, may your foundation turn out to be exactly as solid as the life you built on it." Truth, in my experience, has its own timing. And it always arrives. He set down the glass and walked back to his seat. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then phones came out across the room, one by one, like lights turning on in a building. Sandra's face went completely still. Victor stood up. 2 of the groomsmen exchanged a look. Carter stood at the front of the room, the best man, the endorser, the 28-year-old who had just watched his stepfather's face go the color of old brick under the string lights of a hill country vineyard. My phone rang at 7:02 Austin time. 2:02 in the morning, Malta. I looked at Sandra's name on the screen for 3 rings. I answered. Her voice was something I had never quite heard before. Fury and panic woven together so tightly I couldn't tell where one ended. She said I had arranged it. She said I had hired him. She said I had waited until her happiest moment and destroyed it deliberately, and that I was the same cold, calculating, emotionally absent person I had always been, and that she hoped I understood what I had done to her life. I let her finish. I waited until there was nothing left. Then I said, "Sandra, it's 2 in the morning here. I'm sitting on a balcony in Malta. I don't know who spoke at your wedding or why, but anything he said came from public records that anyone could find. If the foundation was solid, no one's words would have moved it." Silence, long enough that I thought she had hung up. Then a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. The line went dead. I set the phone on the railing and looked at the harbor. The Grand Harbor at 2 in the morning is still and completely sure of itself. Ships at anchor, ancient fortifications holding their position the way they have for 500 years. I sat there until the sky started changing color, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 31 years. Not happiness exactly. Simpler than that. The specific peace of a man who told the truth and didn't apologize for it. Meg sent the video at 9 the next morning. A guest had posted it within an hour of Robert sitting down. By midnight, it had 200,000 views. By the following evening, it had crossed 3 million. The comments were what you'd expect: some outrage, some support, a significant portion of people who immediately looked up Apex Altitude Capital's registration status and were posting screenshots of what they found, or didn't find. The SEC contact form, I was told later, received 17 submissions in the 48 hours after the video went viral. The federal investigation opened within 3 weeks. Interstate securities fraud, operating as an unregistered investment advisor, wire fraud. Victor's accounts were frozen. All 3 entities: Apex Altitude Capital, Crane Digital Assets Partners, Altitude Horizon Fundi, locked pending review. Dennis Caulfield, the former partner with the unsatisfied 2021 judgment, amended his civil filing within days of the video, adding documentation that had been previously sealed under a confidentiality agreement that Caulfield's attorney argued was now void given the public nature of the fraud. The 47 investors retained a class action attorney. The fund's actual assets, when audited, came to $310,000 against $4.2 million in claimed investor balances. Victor had been using new investment to pay the returns of earlier investors, while drawing a personal salary of $380,000 annually from the fund. Classic structure. Same as it always is. The confidence, the photography, the beautiful suit, none of it was the foundation. It was the facade over no foundation at all. Sandra's situation moved faster than I expected. The SUV Victor had given her 2 months before the wedding, $71,000, purchased through fund capital, was flagged by the investors' attorneys as a recoverable asset. The investors filed to include her as a defendant. She retained her own counsel. Her real estate license was reviewed by the Texas Real Estate Commission in connection with client funds she had directed toward the Apex Altitude Fund. 2 clients filed formal complaints. The license was suspended pending investigation. The house in Memorial, with its $700,000 mortgage and $1.1 million appraised value, had a smaller margin than Sandra had understood. Which she tried to sell in November, the market had softened and the appraisal came in at $980,000. After the mortgage payoff, transaction costs, and $210,000 she owed in legal fees and civil judgments related to the investor litigation, she netted almost nothing. She moved to her sister's house in Corpus Christi in December. Carter called me on a Tuesday night in October. It was 4 in the afternoon in Malta. I was at Marcus's coffee bar sketching the Cathedral of St. John when the phone rang. He said, "Dad." 1 word, 2 letters, and I heard everything in it. I said, "Carter." He said his company had put him on paid leave pending an internal review. His professional social media endorsements of Victor were being examined for potential liability in the class action. His manager had asked him directly whether he had known about the financial irregularities before posting the endorsements. He had told the truth, which was that he had not known. He had also told them that he had dismissed a warning from someone who did know. They appreciated his honesty. The leave stood anyway while legal finished their review. He said, "You tried to tell me. You said verify the foundation. I told you I didn't need career advice." I said, "You weren't ready to hear it." He said, "I'm ready now." He said, I've been thinking about something since I watched that video. I spent my whole life believing that the tension in our house was because of you. Mom said you were emotionally distant. She said you never really invested in us. And I accepted that. I never asked you. I never asked anyone. His voice was unsteady. I never even thought to check. I looked at the limestone facade of the cathedral across the piazza, and I thought about all the things I could say to that, all the years I could account for, all the moments I had been present for that hadn't made it into Sandra's version of events. I said, you were a kid doing your best with what you were given. That's all any of us do. He said, I should have asked you. I said, you're asking now. We talked for 2 hours. He asked about Malta, about my health, about what I did with my days. I told him about the bastions and Marcus and the sketching and sleeping 8 hours a night for the first time in my adult life. He laughed at something I said about my terrible first attempt at speaking Maltese. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. At the end he said, can I come visit? I said the door was open whenever he was ready. He said he'd come in the spring. He said he wanted to meet Marcus and see the fortifications. He said he thought he might want to sketch something, though he'd never tried. I told him that was all you needed, a pencil and something worth looking at carefully. After we hung up, I ordered another coffee and sat in the piazza until the light changed. The city held its shape around me, 5 centuries of limestone doing exactly what limestone does, standing in place and outlasting everything that tried to compromise it. 6 months later, the spring Carter mentioned. I met him at Malta International Airport on a clear Thursday morning. He was thinner than I remembered, and more careful about how he held himself, like someone who had learned something hard and was still adjusting to the weight of knowing it. We shook hands, and then he pulled me into a hug, and I held on for a moment longer than the moment strictly required. We walked out into the Maltese morning, and he looked at the limestone and the light and said, Dad, this place. I said, I know. He said, how did you find it? I said, sometimes you just need to pick somewhere that doesn't know who you used to be. Victor Crane was indicted in January, 11 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of operating as an unregistered investment advisor. His trial is scheduled. His attorney is negotiating. The investors' class action has settled in principle for recovery of approximately 22 cents on the dollar from liquidated assets. Sandra is in Corpus Christi. The bankruptcy was finalized in February. Her real estate license remains suspended. She has not called me since the night of the wedding. Meg says she called once in November, asking if I might intervene on the civil suit. Meg told her I was in Malta and didn't involve myself in litigation. I hadn't started. Carter went through his company's review and was cleared. He's in a new role now. Same firm, different position, steadier ground. He started therapy in November, working through some patterns he recognized once he had enough distance to see them. He met a woman in December. He called to tell me about her before he told anyone else. Meg got another promotion. She calls every Sunday. We're solid. My health numbers are the best they've been since I was 40. My doctor in Valletta reviews my chart and says whatever I am doing I should continue. I swim mornings, I have breakfast at Marcus's, I sketch in the afternoons and take Portuguese classes in the evenings because Joseph, the landlord, says a man who only speaks English in Malta is a man who is only half paying attention. My portfolio is generating enough to cover everything I need and a little more. I painted Valletta's Grand Harbor last month and sold the piece to a hotel near the waterfront. It's the first time anything I made with my hands has hung somewhere I can walk past and look at it without being asked to change anything. I am not lonely. I am completely, entirely, quietly content. I don't carry bitterness about Sandra. True indifference is something different from forgiveness. It's the absence of a charge where there used to be one. I hope she finds her footing. I hope she looks at the foundations next time. The lesson I paid for with 31 years of my life is this. Verification is not cynicism. It is the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for the people who depend on your judgment. Public records don't flatter anyone. Financial patterns don't lie. Your body's signals don't lie. And the quiet voice that tells you something isn't structurally sound, that one doesn't lie either. The only question is whether you're willing to listen to it before the wall comes down. These aren't just stories. Every one of them is a lesson someone earned the hard way so that you don't have to. That's the only reason to tell them. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more. I'll be here in Malta on the bastions, paying attention. I see you. Thank you for being here.